And if I'm adept enough to weave in any points that I would have made in an introduction, then I'll certainly do that. But I do just want to place on the public record my acknowledgement and thanks in a couple of different directions. One is the good people at MB, and David Hall is seated at my left hand, and he has a number of colleagues here who, as we've discussed, will cycle through as need be to assist on any technical or specific aspects that I'm able to. But certainly MB have been really great. Their building system performance team are working with me and the government of the day, but also select committees on a number of different reforms. So any credit should be shared with them, and any blame obviously rests firmly on my shoulders. But I do just want to acknowledge the volume of work that's taking place and their professionalism and integrity and diligence that they've been exercising their function. The other acknowledgement, Mr. Chair, is actually for this committee itself. You guys have diligently looked at a couple of pieces of legislation now, and more to come, as we know. And it seems to me the thoughtful and constructive approach in terms of getting into the detail and the implications of legislation. With a starting point, it seems to me, having been from the various political parties, that they agree with various aims that we're looking to achieve, but obviously wanting to scrutinise the detail, as of course they probably should, and speeches in House often given by these same individuals accordingly. So those are my acknowledgements and thanks, and I look forward to the discussion with you over the next hour.
And look, can I also just say thank you? And we have we've picked up the ball and are running with it with the PWA, which we know there's anxiousness to get on with things. So we're actually hearing quite a number of submissions today, and others on Monday is the plan. So
great. Well, hard-working committee.
Trying to get that moved.
Other hats from my point of view, but
right.
Great.
Okay, so first question, Arena.
That's completely right. I agree, and thank you both for coming today. There's so much willingness in this committee room, and Labor has to deregulate in the building and construction sector, because at this point in the cycle, the building and construction sector is asking for those measures which are going to reduce costs and speed things up. And we want that too. And with so much goodwill in the sector, what's next? What are we going to bite off that are those long-term challenges that no one has dealt with that we have an opportunity to do now?
Yeah, well, a really good question, if I may say, and I think you're quite right to mention the point in the cycle. And of course, from my point of view, it seems to me there's a boom-bust cycle over many years, and this is obviously not an original observation, and that's what I think together we can achieve to even out, as opposed to a political cycle. I think it just so happens that we're at a moment now where the understanding in the sector and in the political realm too, but generally there's an understanding that we need a building control system that is responsive to the real world challenges, but also opportunities. I think in terms of what the next steps are, if we take a nuanced approach, a risk proportionate approach, by which I don't, of course, mean a wild deregulation in a way that would cause issues in itself, and also then risk a counter reaction and a swinging of a pendulum, as I think it's fair to say we've probably seen over the years. So we're aiming to achieve a sensible balance, and part of the balance, I think, is understanding the importance of liability settings. So, of course, for building consent authorities, and I acknowledge there's one former mayor in the room who'll be all too well aware of the challenges for local government associated with that building consent authority function, and thinking about the fact of joint and several liability currently being associated with all their work, granting consents, conducting inspections, and then code compliance certificates, of course, at the end of the process. And it seems to me would be helpful if we move to a system that is more nuanced. That's not a government decision that's yet been made, and therefore that I can speak to in definitive terms, but in the spirit of being helpful to the committee and to flag, as I have already, to be fair, in public terms, that's an area of reform that I'm interested in. I think we could end up with a proportionate liability system, for example, as they use in Australia, or some states of Australia, to clarify, that would enable the responsibility also to fall on building professionals, be it designers and the various trades throughout the process, who are undertaking the work, and to make them more responsible. I think actually should make those that are able to be more accountable, take more care for their work. At the same time, of course, as we need to build in protections for vulnerable consumers, and recognise that sadly there are some who will not be able to be treated as responsible in that kind of way.
And completely agree with what you've said, and keen to work with you on it. One thing though we disagree on vehemently is the way that the reforms at the moment are affecting jobs. 15,000 construction jobs lost. The particular part of this I want to get into this today is the 27,000 young Kiwis who left last year, who many of whom would have gone into building and construction and trades work and are in fact doing that in Australia right now and also participating in their housing market, are building and buying their first homes over there. Do any of your reforms get young people into these trades?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different aspects of that question, which is an important one, of course. And of course, by way of background, the macroeconomic settings have been challenging for construction activity. And other committees will this week have been talking about a pipeline of work that will be helpful to even out those flows. And of course, the problem with the boom-bust cycle that we've traditionally had isn't just the bust part, it's actually the boom too, because in relative terms, it's not that we've had a particularly low period of activity in the last 2 or 3 years. It's that coming off a huge high from a few years ago, and not obviously to relitigate government policy from years back that would be inappropriate in an estimates hearing. But the reality is there was an artificial high that was generated for various reasons, and some of which were outside no one's control in terms of COVID itself. But the reality is then coming down and having a huge workforce geared up to undertake a level of building activity that probably wasn't sustainable in the medium term. And as you've said, we've lost some trades persons to Australia, which is unfortunate. Too many All Blacks and Warriors jerseys on building sites in Queensland, Sydney and Melbourne. We need more.
At least gives a home crowd well, people. The teams are playing.
It is good from a Warriors supporter perspective. And we need, if anything, we need a few more Queensland and New South Wales origin jerseys on Kiwi building sites. Just to keep the league theme for a moment. But in order to avoid that, we need a good pipeline of work, and the pipeline of work, again, on a bipartisan basis, I think will be helpful for large-scale infrastructure projects. And the macroeconomic conditions, of course, in terms of inflation now being back within that band, interest rates able to come down following OCR decisions by the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and general confidence, including with the stability now around unemployment rates. It seems to me better times are ahead, and the sector does feel that. But in the meantime, the reforms that I'm able to undertake in terms of building and construction to make it easier and faster and more certain to be able to get consents to do the work, including some categories of work without consents, will be hugely directly beneficial to getting us out of that hole in which we've dug ourselves as a country.
Is the plan to fill those gaps with migration when inevitably the residential building sector does pick up? And we lag behind for 2 years as the sector not only trains those people, but also gets back on its feet as we've lost many of the small and medium-sized builders in the market already.
The intention is to have Kiwis trained to do the work, and obviously a number of different aspects to that. Part of it is the vocational education piece led by my colleague and friend Penny Simmons. My contribution to that work has been listening carefully to the construction sector, as she has as well, I should acknowledge, and relaying to her the importance from the industry's perspective of standard setting, course content and delivery that is closely aligned with industry. Now, we've got a licensed building practitioner in our ranks, so he might have a view on that as well, but it seems to me that if we have a model that maximises that industry reality about how training can be delivered in order for people to be able to learn, to train, and then of course on the job training activities are available. But the most important thing simply in terms of retaining, as you've rightly noted, as well as training in the first place, will be to have good high activity levels, because then owners of building and construction businesses will feel confident they can take on people, they'll have the work available, it'll be productive and profitable enough for them to remain on their books, and then they will be up and down this green and pleasant land, not across the Tasman or elsewhere.
That's right, but what you described as an artificial high for the building sector was labour building homes and schools and then paying apprentices to train up in the industry and to take those jobs on. We've seen 15,000 jobs lost, and a government campaigned on keeping apprenticeship boosts and then cut it in half. Apprentices aren't paid and helped to be in those roles now in the way that the Prime Minister promised them they would be at the election. Why have we gotten rid of that key pipeline of skilled work for Kiwis at a time when the building and construction sector says that they need it and says that this would be a really key reform?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of activity that flows from government procurement. For example, huge number of classrooms. I think I'm right in saying, and I don't want to put on record if it's not correct, but I think it's the highest number of classroom build activity last year ever. And if that's the case, then I know that the conversation in the House of Parliament was that, oh, well, that was all Labour's work. Well, that's fine if that's true. And it's true, of course, there is a lag effect in some activity that takes place in any given year. It has, of course, been planned in previous years, but I would respectfully say that the opposition can't have its cake and eat it too. You can't say that there hasn't been a high level of activity because it's all the fault of the current government.
School builds.
And, pardon me?
You cut 200 school builds.
No, there's a lot of school building.
Arena, can we just let them answer, please?
Well, point of order. I mean, is this actually, this is not really in the minister's role. He's not procurement. This is about, we want to be talking about the building industry, the statutory obligations and the reforms that are coming, other things that are actually.
I think I think that is correct. We are starting to stray outside of it. So I'll leave it to you to answer what you want to answer. And if we're going to start offering opinions on it, I'd like to have a chance to offer my opinion on why we had a boom.
Thank you.
What you want to answer next, please.
Would you like an opinion from Cameron?
Of course.
I don't think you'll like it, but
I'm not sure that I get to ask the questions, but maybe I'll pose a hypothetical and see who comes in on it. But I think actually, I mean, and of course, our friend's point of order is the right one in terms of the scope of the committee, but I will say the intersection of those is that the reform work that Erica Stanford has led as Education Minister in terms of their procurement is technically outside our work program is actually taking cognizance of the fact that within the sector there's a huge appetite for standardisation, for off-site manufacturing, for the lack of disruption, therefore, in terms of classroom and school builds, thinking about construction sites in which young people are also learning, but also that's going to deliver a huge additional amount for the amount allocated. So while it might be the case that one could say, compare relative amounts on spend, the reality is we want the outcomes, we want the bang for the buck, we want the number of classrooms, not the mere, balance sheet reflected in the budget that politicians can fight over.
Okay, I've got two subs on two aspects of the things that you've been asked about already. First one's the joint and several liability, and then I'm going to go to you, Dan. The joint and several liability, which, as you alluded to, we do have a former mayor in the room who was on just about to hand back our building warrant because of the liabilities being so high. If you're going for joint and several liability, have you given any thought to, I mean, often you might have dodgy builder, 2023 and, dodgy architect 2024 or whatever, something goes wrong, they go out of business and suddenly they're out of the way, which has been part of the problem. Have you given any thought to whether if there's any reform in this area, it might not be as direct, but you might say, hey, the people who are involved in that entity, that the industry knows who they are, they know that they have a dubious record, and we're not going to let them set up another entity, at least not without, I would imagine insurance will get involved in this kind of thing, but saying, well, you're a great builder, your insurance level's down here, you've got a bad record, your insurance level is going to be up here if you get insurance at all. And that starts giving some market signals to people to say, hey, you do your job properly, because otherwise, we might send you off to Australia.
Absolutely right. And of course, that's the right point, because having sat in that role, you'll be aware that the havoc that is wrought by some combination of incompetent, careless, insolvent practitioners obviously can affect very deeply individual building owners or would-be owners in the case of, first home buyers, home and build package, for example. Well, that's right. But also from a local government point of view, you'll be aware of the effect on the balance sheet of councils, large and small, up and down this land. So we do need to resolve it. And part of it is what we would call cracking down on cowboys. At an individual trade level, it's about being much more specific about ways that we can hold to account dodgy practitioners, or ones who frankly need greater scrutiny. And part of the reform whereby we're going to be more enabling of those who can be trusted because they've got qualification, experience, insurance, or guarantees or bonds or some other way of providing comfort to the consumer and the system as a whole. And knowing that if we are more enabling in that space, we can provide greater scrutiny and oversight of those that are poor practitioners, poor performers. And to pick up on your point about sometimes that's an easy matter of knowing historically that a developer has turned out his or her or its pockets following a poor development that's gone badly wrong, left subcontractors as well as would-be owners in the lurch. And knowing that if we can crack down on that, including by way of piercing the corporate veil, as lawyers say, so look beyond those individual company entities or trusts or individual ownership that might seek to hide assets in a way that's frankly unfair. I'm really confident we can get to the bottom of that, and the design of a system around responsible builders being held accountable will take into account the possibility or avoid the possibility that some sort of fancy footwork by the developer and its lawyers would have them sort of avoid responsibility. So deeply mindful of that, the need to address that.
No, that's very good. The second part of that, which relates to the same thing. So it was interesting at Field Days, excellent opportunity to go around and talk to some of the builders of small buildings, which are, are prefabricated, etc. Bring them to. So some of them are really excited by the change in removing the building consent, but others are concerned about the cowboy builder.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether there's any way of potentially giving surety to people, even if you're not giving a building consent to the building, that we can, because we're licensing, we're now moving to license, electricians, gas fitters, plumbers, etc. So we say, you are a good operator. Is there any reason that we can't also do the same for some of these building providers, the good ones, and say, well, it's just like your.
Don't want to get out my LBP card.
But that's it. To say, hey, these guys have got the A certificate.
Yeah.
These guys have got no certificate at all.
Yeah.
It sends a clear signal to the market. I'll deal with the guys who are reputable, and at least it's not their building that's being talked about; it's them. Their company, whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a meaningful conversation about where registration and licensing, including through the licensed building practitioner regime, should sit with the individual, the person, the practitioner, or the entity under whose name the work is taking place. The reality is that we don't, whatever that system looks like, we need not to have a gap between the two, such that the individual who's responsible for the work could avoid accountability, or vice versa. And in terms of that regime, the licensed building practitioner system, obviously it exists already, but it's an open question as to whether there should be some reform of that, as well as occupational licensing moves that we could make across the system more generally. And so we're interested in that. And in relation to flats policy, hearing feedback was really detailed and thoughtful and helpful about the prevalence of level entry showers, for example, in small dwellings that are remote or standalone, and needing to avoid leakage in a way that would damage that building. The decision was made by MB, and may I say a very good one, to introduce a new class of LBP license around waterproofing. So to have a more nuanced system that actually takes into account the risk associated with structures, in this case, that are otherwise relatively low risk, demonstrates that commitment to a system that's quite nuanced in that space. So I think that will be helpful. But I will just finally point out, Mr. Chair, in terms of a lot of these moves to be more enabling where there is low risk topology as compared with the bespoke typologies or the higher risk practitioners, that to the extent that these are opt-in systems, it could be, for example, that if you are a building owner or want to own an additional building on your farm, as you've alluded to Field Days, you don't have to go through that system. You can insist actually on a building consent being required and furnished for your benefit or the benefit of your insurer or your lender.
Cam.
Thank you. Just a few sups on the previous answers you've just given to the question. When you talk about proportional liability, I understand it's a work program that you're looking at doing. Would there be regulatory relief that came along with that? Like if we started to say this is the liability that you have as an entity, as a license or as a BCA, would we start taking away from consenting authorities the ability to ask so many questions, to have so many points of rejection? If we're going to start having it's just if you're a design LBP, you design a building, you're taking on the liability proportionately, but you have to have everything checked by a BCA because we're joint and several. Is there change you're going to make there? Looking at?
Yes, there is. Can I just pause for a moment, if I may, Mr. Chair, to acknowledge Caroline Tremaine of MB. I know
You've got who to be here.
you'll be the busiest person in this building potentially this week with so many different scrutiny appearances as head of MB. And you missed me acknowledging the team before. I was just placing on record earlier the way that your team has worked so very well in relation to the reforms that we're now discussing.
Apologies to the committee.
In terms of the reforms as to liability, you rightly touched on, I think, a key aspect, which is that there has to be a quid pro quo for building consent authorities as a matter of fairness to them, but also to ensure that responsible builders, and I mean building professionals generally, just excuse the shorthand, are held to account for work that they do and therefore need to pay great attention to it. Of course, it's the case that a building consent authority that must be deemed to have consented to work will not be required to, and in fact may not conduct the full range of inspections and other assurances that would be the case if it were on the hook. And I think a helpful discussion took place at this committee in relation to building products in terms of overseas approval for those. And the point was rightly made by the committee that it wouldn't be right for building consent authorities to have to deem as approved any products that were approved overseas according to credible and comparable jurisdictions equivalent or higher standards if they didn't have the opportunity to go and test those themselves or rely on the New Zealand-based code mark system. So it's a quid pro quo, and of course the system is designed specifically not to avoid accountability attaching to any player, thereby leaving a gap for the vulnerable consumer, but actually to say that if the appropriate place to put that is those that are doing the work and they are willing and able meaningfully to stand behind that, then it will be to everyone's benefit to allow them to get on and do it and take counsel and their ratepayer liability out of the question.
I think may not, councils may, in a lot of cases, don't actually have to do some inspections when engineering consultants take on those, but they still choose to in many cases. And when you have an LBP, multiple LBPs, engineers looking at it, multiple inspections from a council, the same hole, you've got to, and the council doesn't have that liability currently, it's might not be a strong enough disincentive for that. The other thing I just wanted to follow up on your previous answers was the liability cover that councils have. What is there? Does MB have oversight over what BCAs currently have as liability cover?
Well, I know the accreditation system is run by an outfit called IANS, I think I'm right in saying. And that's every 2 years they go through their hoops, both in terms of their quality assurance processes and being able to conduct the inspections, for example, in a manner that's appropriate, but also their business practices, I suppose one might describe it as. And that's the case already for existing building consent authorities and any would-be new players. And in fact, that was recently the case for an entity that was able to prove that it had what's known as adequate means to be able to conduct its operations and also to meet any shortfalls. The new BCA startup in Christchurch, but so that happens for councils right now. MB has the numbers, has the bonds. I'm seeing head shaking right now. Is the liability cover that councils have visible to this committee?
Yeah. Did you want to know? And if you could let us know who you are and your role, please, for the record.
Kia ora, I'm Ingrid Hayes, I'm the General Manager for Building and Tenancy within MB. Part of my responsibility is to have oversight over the BCAs. So to your particular point, the answer is no. However, part of the oversight we have in conjunction with IANS is to, as the Minister said, around processes, around business capability, around a whole range of things. We issue also recommendations for improvement where we see fault, but we don't have sight of the insurance.
I think that's part of the thing is this committee's often heard that councils and BCAs have to carry a great deal of cover and the cost that's associated with that. But actually, I'm having a lot of trouble trying to find where those costs actually are, where they're being charged on, where the background actual, the underwriting or buying long-term bonds or cover in any way is actually being accounted for. And yet if we're going to start asking LBPs and self-certifiers to carry some cover, it seems fair that if they're going to compete in a market where they're saying use my cover service as opposed to a BCA cover service, the BCA is actually charging for that and it's visible to Parliament.
I would expect some of that expenditure would come through some of the local government reporting mechanisms. So that would be through the Department of Internal Affairs, and they have the best view of local government and councils and what obligations, assets, etc. are by that particular group.
Shall ask them.
So I mean,
you
I
have
can
already.
Yeah, no, we'll leave it for this committee. It's fine.
So just to sort of add to that, so councils are sort of unique to the extent that they're required to be a BCA, whereas private BCAs go through a process. Most councils hold the liability as a contingent liability on their books. So it's really only sort of.
And there's no sorry, to finish this up, Chair, just to make the point, if it's a contingent liability, there's nothing being put aside for it. There's no long-term bonds. There's no actual cost that's being passed on for this.
Yeah.
But they are forced to be a BCA, which is a default insurer, but the RBNZ is insurers and has no oversight over BCAs. Financial Market Authority doesn't have any. It seems like we're going to start pushing costs onto builders, broadly defined. Then the other side that's coming from, the costs need to be paid. Anyway, that was just a couple of things on that. Happy to yield to the next question.
It's primaries.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Minister, and welcome Carolyn and David. Turning now to overseas building products. Since the bill was enacted, I'm keen to get an update from you, Minister, around where we're at. I know we've got a target of July, I think, 12,000 building products.
Yep.
And then 250,000 by the end of this year. So just walk us through the mechanics of enabling that to happen, if you can.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do that in broad brush strokes, and then if any colleagues and friends from MB want to add, of course I'd welcome that. But in broad brush terms, is the committee will be aware, having worked diligently on the passage of its stage of the passage of the legislation. That's enabling framework that sets out the principles according to which the regime will then operate going forward. And it creates a regulation making power such that over time, certification systems, standards that are able to be recognised from overseas jurisdictions, national or state, that are credible and comparable to New Zealand conditions and no lower, so at least as high or higher than those already in New Zealand. And so that's an iterative process. So you're right to note that next month it will be that we expect 12,000 new products will be available, as already signed off overseas in the New Zealand market, without having to jump through those hoops of code mark or at the individual BCA level. And progressively from there, leading up to, perhaps as many as 250,000 products by the end of the year. And I mean, it might be, some of these are screws and taps and washers. So that might sound like a large number of new products, but some of them are modest in terms of scale. But if you go back to the policy intent, if I can just spring off your initial question around the timing and the extent of it, I think the downward pressure on prices that we will see as a result, and the improved competition, which will also help in terms of innovation, with all the implications for better quality, more sustainable building products, a point acknowledged and made well, I thought, by the Honourable Julianne Genter in her speech in the House on the legislation, will be really beneficial. So we're really pleased that from next month on, we'll increasingly see products in the market from that BPS source, I think we're saying. Is that the right acronym? And was there anything else that Caroline, David, or others would add?
Look, just to add, the building product specification is out now for consultation. So that's quite a significant change. I think that's due to come into force in July, so only a matter of weeks away. And then the regulations that will enable the schemes like Watermark to be allowed into New Zealand as a requirement. I think that's targeted to September. So it's very close to being fully implemented.
And just in terms of flow through to actually making a difference, because we want this to make a difference. I mean, is there much thought around, okay, once you make the decision and the products are allowed, how is that communicated? And then what's your expectation of when that will actually start to make a difference to building costs and the flow through? It's knowing that it's a bit of a bubble here and, how does your average builder like Cameron, well, not average.
I think
how's your-
the exceptional builder like
exceptional, how does the exceptional builder like Cameron become aware, and then when do they start? Because they'll have a stock, of course, that they've got to get through. So I guess walk me through your expectations of when this will actually make a difference to
Depends a little bit
cost.
on the scale, doesn't it, of the entity. So I think that's something that we're going to be monitoring quite a bit, just to see how it actually pans out. And David, I would imagine there'll be some particular products in due time that you'll be following critically.
fantastic.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, we're already having a lot of discussions with the bulk purchasers, the people who already have an interest in the overseas products in terms of, how things are going and how they may address it. So, it's not as if there's sort of a vacuum now and suddenly we'll have a whole lot of comms out about it. The work's ongoing and through people like our building advisory panel as well, that has representatives of the product purchasers on it.
Fantastic, thank you.
I don't know, you've got a SUP and then you've got the next primary as well, so.
Thank you. I am keen to understand that monitoring function. It was something that I have looked through the estimates for, and was interested in you commenting about what you've told Minister MB that they should be monitoring, when some of those performance measures to me look largely administrative, like the number of OAs, the number of consultations. But we're talking about this in the context of build costs per square metre in New Zealand being perhaps double what they are in Australia by some measures. No one's expecting this to fix it all.
No.
I don't even know if you are. You're calling it not a silver bullet, but why? What are you telling MB to monitor here?
Yeah, I mean, very, very fair to acknowledge, and of course you're right that this isn't itself the single silver bullet that will solve the problem of housing affordability or building and affordability more generally. Up to 25% of the cost of a construction work is contained in the products and supplies. So even if products were free, then the maximum that one could obtain would be a 25% reduction. So we think it'll make a meaningful difference, though, having said that. And while it's difficult to quantify exactly the extent of that, because as Caroline's rightly noted, it will depend on the extent of scale and uptake, and we genuinely haven't predetermined, the products in systems. So because it's deliberative and careful, albeit that, as David has said, the work's been going on, it's difficult to come up with a measure along the lines of affordability gains. I would say I've deliberately used the phrase downward pressure on prices, because of course if prices go up in time naturally according to other factors, for example the cost of shipping, and production, energy, security and resilience, and cost being what it is in this country and overseas. But with the potential that it offers, I think we'll get some good results. Yes, to some extent there are administrative measures that are rightly in place in terms of ways that we can measure performance, but I would point out that we already have a system in which overseas products are allowed and indeed predominate to the extent of 90% of the market within New Zealand. And so it seems to me, and I'll be prepared to be corrected if necessary, that the existing mechanisms we've got, according to which we might withdraw the approval of an existing product and the existing scheme, would continue to apply. But if Caroline, David, or
I'm keen to come back to this with MB in the session we've got with them. Okay. Thank you. The competition point, also agree with that. Like, a lack of competition in the building sector is something that you've spoken about a lot. Why then is the program of work that is called Cracking Down on Cowboys about some of the smallest players in the industry, when you yourself have hesitated to call out the use of market power in something like the GIB crisis?
Well, I'll start by acknowledging that the work done by the Commerce Commission in 2022 was before my time, and I think it's been an idea that's been around for a long period of time, frankly, the idea that we need a greater level of competition. I'm not a one-person Commerce Commission. It's not appropriate for me to speak to individual market practices in a way that would be constitutionally inappropriate. We have systems and mechanisms for that already. But I've been really clear that when there are ways of a market producing outcomes that effectively lock in market dominance in a way that's anti-competitive, then that's something we can and should address. And indeed, this regime will go a long way towards that, I believe. But I would also just note that in terms of products now being able to be specified in the alternative within a building consent application, that's a change that's been made within the last 18 months as well, so that you could specify, for example, in a building consent application, one type of plasterboard or another. And also we've clarified what are known as minor variations and now minor customizations, such that a whole new building consent or even a formal variation to a consent need not be obtained if it's something that's essentially a like for like change, or something that won't have a negative effect, for example, on the structure of a building or an improvement. And the purpose of that, of course, is to obtain greater flexibility, so that if a particular type of plasterboard, for example, is mentioned in the initial consent application, duly approved, but that's unavailable, or there's a cheaper alternative that's, also meets the specifications, then that can be substituted along the way much more readily. So we think that those changes taken together will have a positive effect. And as for cracking down on cowboys, I make no apologies for the fact that I am really interested in ensuring that we don't have small players that are doing a poor job, but also larger players that are doing a small job. I think we need to look everywhere in the system where damage can be wrought to the detriment of the individual consumer, and go after them all, which is exactly what we're doing.
Well, and just one more supplementary on this before my colleague from the ACT Party put it to you that you are pushing costs on small builders, and that I think we all agree that there will be some pain for the building sector as well as gains from this reform. Why is that small builders? Why, even when we're talking about plasterboard here in this room right now, won't you talk about the way that Fletcher's has influenced the New Zealand market and building construction in this way, in the situation that we're now in, and having to make regulatory reform to adjust that?
Yeah, well, I mean, whether or not you've fairly characterised the comments of Mr. Luxon, I'll leave for him. But
He's next up anyway.
Okay, I sense from his body language that you might have not done so, but certainly from my point of view, I don't think it's at all fair or correct to say that we'll be adding costs to small businesses that are builders. The fact that we will provide an option, and I emphasise option, for a responsible builder regime, whereby those that are able to do work will be able to stand behind it, including through insurance to the extent that's available, doesn't mean that there is a mandatory path for all and sundry. And actually, I think the opportunity for relatively small scale building professionals to get much faster response times from their local council or other BCA is high, given that we will be able to be more enabling for larger players that will be able to stand behind their work because they've got the balance sheet, because they're able to convince a bank or an insurer that they will be able to stand behind the work. So I think it will be a win-win when we start being more nuanced and don't have the lowest common denominator driven system that we currently do.
If one more question before Julianne, or?
Is that, I thought it was primary, that was it?
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So I'll go primary over here then. Okay, so Cam and then
Yeah,
Julianne.
the costs that are driven onto the entire system is not as, I wouldn't suggest it was because of monopoly. I would say the regulations that need amending, which, Minister, you've been doing, are contributing to the ability for people to corner a market. Also, the response times are a major cost on smaller players and small builders and tradies in the market. I saw great, I was pleased to see when you initially took on this role, you initiated a processing time scrutiny for publicising how long building consent authorities are taking to issue consents and code of compliance. Do you think that the current measure of that is capturing the delay? And admittedly, the market's slowing down a lot. So would that, and because of processes, we could have a fun debate on, but it has slowed down. And if we were still at a high level, would we be seeing that drop? Do you think that the ability to stop the clock through RFIs and other things is actually, and other methods in that building consenting authorities can use, do you think that's skewing these numbers?
Yeah, the voice of experience asks a really useful question. I think there are two different ways that you can measure the time that it takes to issue a building consent. One is, as you've quite rightly noted, the statutory timeframe is one measure, but to the extent that requests for further information or RFIs mean that the timeframes involved do become greater, and the real world time that it takes to gain a consent is longer, notwithstanding that the statutory timeframe might have been met with the clock stop during the RFI process. That is why, in addition to MB collecting from all the BCAs around the country, the data around the time according to the statutory clock, also the real world time in which consents are issued. So between that, I think we'll have a good set of data. And to the extent that sunlight is the best form of disinfectant, I think that transparency is helpful for people to understand the system as it currently is operating, and noting that there are some very well performing BCAs as well as some that unfortunately couldn't be described in that way. But also because that's helped to inform future policy choices, and we've touched already on the potential to change the liability settings, but also the structure of the BCAs themselves. So I think between those things, we'll end up in a better place. And in the meantime, on the subject of timeframes, if I can, having talked about the possibility of remote visual inspections being able to be used much more readily, perhaps even as a default system, having had the feedback that while there is great potential to improve inspection times using remote visual technology, A, and B, that some are already using it. Nevertheless, we made a decision as a government that actually the better way to approach things would be to say that if we have a timeframe based standard rather than requiring certain types of inspections to be conducted on a remote basis, then we get to the right result, which is, as we've landed on 80% of inspections to be completed within 3 working days, and then being agnostic as to the way that councils achieve it. And if they can lean on remote visual inspection technology, which already exists, of course, in various platforms to achieve that, then good luck to them. But if they want to use another method as well and have more of their council officers driving around the countryside with clipboards, then good luck to them on that too.
Yeah, so along another thing that can delay, 25% of the cost is material, there's labour, there's land costs, and all of that sort of reflects some underlying costs that can be using. Section 71, 2 and 3, Section 71 of the Building Act, where a council can delay due to issues with the ground stability or flooding or other thing. I've come across many cases where you would, even from a trained eye, question whether that was relevant, being used as intended by the Building Consent Authority. Do you have any numbers? Does MB have numbers on the amount of times that a consent is delayed, held up, denied because of a Section 71?
No, I can't specifically. I don't know if we've broken it down to Section 71. We know RFIs on average add about 12 working days to the processing time for a consent, which wouldn't be reflected in those official numbers. Okay. We know that 2/3 of consent applications are subject to an RFI. So
one again, you said 2/3?
2/3 of building consent applications are subject to an RFI, at least one or many. And to be fair to the TLAs, there's some work that's done by the University of Auckland, which has also identified that some of the applications are poor coming in.
I wouldn't be freaking out about the 2/3 thing. Yeah, but so another, I've got on this line question. Do you have any oversight over how often a section, the exemption section, which I think is Section 67, how often a council will to actually say, we accept that this is a building that can be, but even though it's not completely aligned with exactly what the code says, can we take an opinion to say that this is sufficient to perform well? Have you got any oversight of how often that's being used by BCAs?
Look, I'll look at my comments, but no, look,
Final question on numbers then. What about multi-proof? Have we had, multi-proof's a great scheme. How often has multi-proof been implemented in the past 12 months? Or how many applications do you think are going to be in for the next?
Can I start by saying I can hear some papers being shuffled, and at some point I'll be rescued, no doubt, by someone from MB who has the number. And certainly I've seen the number of briefings, and perhaps the thing, Mr. Chair and clerks, if we don't have it to hand, we might commit to coming back to you on that.
Yeah, look, I think we'll definitely make those. Some of those numbers across the board will be really useful. I mean, 2/3 are, RFIs is just staggeringly high. That says something about both ends, probably.
Can I just comment, because I do recall this from the various excellent briefings that I've been provided. A multi-proof system, I agree, is an excellent scheme on paper, but the reality is, for whatever reason, it's had not only less uptake than one might think, but decreasing uptake over time, which when you think about a scheme that, it makes all the right kinds of moves in the direction of saying, well, here's the standard consent, you can continue to use it as many times as you want once you've, gone through the admittedly more lengthy and difficult process of getting it. So I'm not quite sure what causes that, but if others at the table or behind me have a view on that, then that might be helpful to partly answer your question, albeit without the numbers around it.
Yeah.
Anything you'd add there, guys? I mean, the only thing I just really echo what you've said, Minister, if we do have that information, I certainly don't have it on me today, and we can talk
It
to
would certainly be
see.
interesting to understand why it's getting decreasing use over time, but.
Yeah, I can add something to that. So just to support the comments already made, it hasn't, I guess, reached its promise in terms of volume. One of the elements that we have removed or changed the system is to allow for minor customisations that slightly kind of divert from the multi-proof approved application. I think that will unlock a bit more use. One of the challenges that we face is that we don't record how many times a multi-proof is in a consent application. And it ties back to your questions around really understanding data. So my team's got a program of what's all of the types of data we would like to collect from BCAs. That's one of them when a multi-proof application is used. But the points that you've raised around, when's exceptions kind of justified by or used by council, we can add that type of thing to our data, overall data program. The whole, I guess, objective is for us to understand much more that when the different provisions of the Act are used and potentially educate people more. So coming back to the RFI question, we don't understand it yet. It's on our program. We don't understand yet the reasons why the RFIs are made. But if we can get that feeds into our overall education program. Hopefully we can get better applications in or support councils to understand better so that they're not asking or issuing these RFIs. So at the next hearing, I hope that we'd be able to give a further update about.
That'd be good, because in the industry, you hear both sides blaming each other.
That's right. Will be kind of a source of truth. That's the objective.
I think, Cam, that happens in every single industry.
Yes.
There are multiple sides and every other side is pointing fingers at the other side. But look, it would be really good. It would
Except
be really
politics,
good.
of course. Sorry, not politics, obviously.
No, I never said politics. But it would be really good to get some of that data and what data you've already got around multi-proof, around RFIs, and whether there are, particular BCAs which are more prone to it than others. But if you've got 2/3 doing it at least once, it's pretty hard to sort the sheep from the goat, so to speak. Yeah. Julianne.
New Zealand has a notoriously low standard when it comes to energy efficiency in our building code relative to other countries. And we pay for that as a country with our emergency department, hospitalizations, kids with asthma, high power bills, which, reduces the ability of households to spend money on other things. The Building for Climate Change work was somewhat addressing the idea of lifting building performance over time. As far as I can see, there's no work being done on that now. What is the government's intention around the building code with respect to energy efficiency and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, a really, really important question, if I may say. And yes, it's important that we take into account these considerations from the purpose of human health as well as financial factors at a household level. And of course, if we can do this, and I'm determined we can do this in a way that doesn't blow out the affordability of new builds particularly, then that's what we should be aiming for in a policy sense. We've been doing work to understand what incentives or enabling and empowerment can be given to those who are building in a sustainable way. And as you'll be well aware, there are different ways that we can measure that. And so while it's not the instinct of the government to impose new regulation that would add to the cost in terms of disclosure or mandating other requirements than currently exist, we know that we can make life easier for those who are making responsible choices, reduce the upfront costs so that then later they can get the benefit without being priced out of the market from home ownership in the first place. So we think that's the right place to be. And in the meantime, in terms of sustainability and certainly from a climate change and energy resilience perspective, I was really pleased to be able to announce last week, along with Minister Simon Watts, that we will require that preferencing be given to new build consent applications that have solar panels as part of their design in half the current statutory timeframe, and also that with the appropriate safeguards around the installation, as to working at height and other factors, in terms of existing builds, to have solar panels simply placed on the roof should not and will in future not require a building consent. So I think that, again, will remove a barrier as to cost and time involved in making a responsible change. And then the final one I'll just say on the subject is that New Zealand recently became a signatory, or we recently decided to become a signatory to the Declaration de Chalieu, excuse pronunciation, high school French kicking in. But that was an initiative at an international level to which New Zealand was invited to participate, whereby now we are going through the process of signing up such that we'll be able to be in those international forums, share the information and learn from best practice of other countries in terms of how we can improve our system performance in relation to embodied and operational carbon.
Can I just ask, because, I understand that the government may have a view that they don't want to impose more regulations, but most of the countries that have better energy performance standards have lower build costs than New Zealand. Have you considered that having raising the standard for everyone is one of the ways to drive down the cost of energy efficiency, because then the windows and the other products and the design all become standard with, as long as we don't lift that bar for everyone, there's nothing to drive the supply chain.
Yeah, I think it's a very nuanced and helpful point, and certainly that's been a factor that I've borne in mind. In terms of improving system performance overall, as you've described, but also as a matter of fairness as to manufacturers who have geared up in anticipation of changes to the H1 chapter within the building code around energy efficiency. And so it was that in late 2023, those rules changed, and businesses as well as individual, building practitioners and homeowners acted in good faith on the basis of the new rules. So part of the discussion about how we can ensure we have suitably high standards and a well-functioning industry to support them was asking if there are ways that we can be more nuanced about achieving those aims, so that, for example, windows that are manufactured with low E, that is reflective glass, which have effectively I want to say insulating effect, but reduce the extent to which sunlight could heat up a place and cause it to become overheated. If that will get us to the right place such that we don't need then to load extra cost in terms of, glass-based insulation and walls and so on, then a more nuanced approach will actually enable us to get best bang for buck economically, but also in terms of energy performance. So the work that MB's done to understand how those systems can better interact will soon come to fruition. And to be fair, it's their decision, not mine. But it seems to me that it could be helpful if we point people more in the direction of calculation and modelling methods, those more nuanced ways of taking into account climate and different practices to achieve those aims, rather than the blunt instrument approach that is the schedule method within the current legislation, secondary legislation. So I'm quite positive that we'll end up with a good result in that.
And can I ask about building waste as well? I mean, building waste apparently makes up a huge proportion of our landfill, 40 to 50%. I've spoken with builders who are really passionate about the issue and would love to be able to reduce waste in their practice, but it's kind of a system issue. So if it doesn't have government leadership and investment support, is there anything in the budget to support waste reduction in the building sector? Because it's sort of like, it has to do with how things are specified, how the products are supplied. There's the possibility of doing it in a way that reduces waste, but without any sort of system leadership from government, it's unlikely to happen, because small players, can't drive this change themselves, and the large players certainly haven't been doing it. So,
yeah, I mean, I think there are some outfits that are large and small that have, through enlightened self-interest or simply wishing to do the right thing by the planet and the people, taking quite a proactive stance in this regard. I think anything we can do to make it easier to remediate or strengthen an existing building, and I'll come back to the point about strengthening in a moment if I may, is really helpful in this regard, because obviously as you quite rightly note, landfill contribution from construction sites is huge. It's far too large, and of course the extra costs associated with that activity is something we would want to avoid. So regulatory changes that make it more easy for people to remediate buildings, I think, is a good thing in that regard. As for strengthening specifically, obviously there's a major body of work around earthquake-prone buildings and wanting to have a risk proportionate system that's actually realistic. And there are lots of different elements, including the heritage angle, which is very topical in a week that we're talking about Gordon Wilson Flats here in Wellington. And I sense the chair doesn't want me to dwell too much on that subject. You know what I mean? I shouldn't go too far into Gordon Wilson Flats, not without a hard hat anyway. No.
True. I can tell you that I sat on the original hearing to delist it, and we thought that the evidence was compelling to delist it. So it's taken a long time.
Proven right again, Mr. Chair. Anyway, I shouldn't go too far down any rabbit holes in that regard. But in terms of earthquake-prone building rules, I think if we can make it more realistic for people to be able to understand genuine real-world life safety risk posed by the possibility of earthquakes, such that we don't need to demolish a lot of buildings that are, for example, relatively low, by which I mean, 1 or 2 stories, potentially even 3, thinking about the possibility of unreinforced masonry being able to be contained. So you remove that falling risk, which is obviously a lot cheaper and less disruptive than structural risk, which is a different kettle of fish, but which I think is somewhat conflated in terms of our current system. So that's something I'm really passionate about doing, and having seen the result of some excellent work that MB has led, but with an independent panel doing that with expertise and a very broad range of voices. I'm looking forward to discussing with this committee and others in the near future what the possible new regime could be along those lines.
Can you just give us a timing on that? So that's the side of Christmas, I'm assuming.
Yes, the side of Christmas for sure. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I'm conscious that for those who are living this, nightmare, it's probably not too strong a word to use, of the uncertainty. And I don't mean uncertainty associated with the current pause and the review, because it was inevitable, I think, that review would take place at, roughly speaking, the 10-year mark following the regulations being put in place. But just the difficulty of meeting those requirements, and certainly from a local government point of view, is the difficult position as a regulator, but also in many cases the owner of such buildings. There's appetite from everyone, to hopefully move to a more workable and realistic system, but also one that we get to sooner rather than later in the interest of certainty.
So your advice to anybody who is contemplating the seismic standards of their buildings would be to tie-ho until this advice is available?
No, individual buildings will vary according to the extent of risk at the moment. And of course, there are buildings that are just genuinely risky propositions. Yes. And I wouldn't want to be seen to discourage anyone from doing anything to make it safer.
I think of ones which are more in the margins.
Yeah, well, what I can and should say, Mr. Chair, is that I'm confident that within the next few months we'll have a much clearer way ahead, and certainly before Christmas we'll have a clearer way ahead about what the rules can and should look like. But in the meantime, for those that can afford to and are able to undertake work that strengthens a building, that will be valuable in any case. And certainly there might be other imperatives around tenancy, around insurance, around lending that are outside the realm of government regulation, outside that life safety risk, that might dictate that it would be prudent for them to get on and do that work. So I just want to be really clear that I wouldn't wish to discourage that.
I don't know.
Just a couple of quick supplementaries on what you've said, and thank you for the update on the earthquake work. That is really important work. Thinking about those residential owners for whom there's not an obvious solution there from governments and pensions, are they at the table? Are they involved in the consultations that you're doing? Are they involved with MB at the moment?
Yeah, very much so. And by residential, do you mean specifically apartment owners?
Yeah, the small owners who are affected by this, usually the apartments, the flats, the multi ownership structures.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and a good point, if I may say, really mindful that some of those apartment owners are in the most difficult situation, not least of all because the relatively low value of the unit relative to the cost of remediating or, worst case scenario, demolishing and rebuilding a whole building. And then you've got the complexity of the structures of ownership under the Unit Titles Act. So very mindful of the difficulties they face, and they've been at the table, they've been in that review. And, we'll do their best by them, even as we, of course, acknowledge that, we can't wish away the existence of risk in this situation, sadly, of large buildings in earthquake-prone areas, which, some of which are apartments in Wellington, just because that's the real world risk that we are anxious to understand and account for, but, in a reasonable way, but not being blind to it either.
Yeah. And just quickly to pick up on your answer to Julianne's questions around energy standards, I think your answer is something I agree with, but I think you're talking about residential builds there in terms of adding on costs for affordability. The case completely changes when we're talking about commercial buildings that exist. What about that easy to go, ready to go work that EB has already done on commercial buildings, energy standards when they are being leased?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point. Commercial as opposed to residential real estate does provide different opportunities. And so you'll no doubt be aware of the Neighbours Scheme, a joint Trans-Tasman initiative. Yep.
Just do it.
Yeah, which and suffice to say there are good opportunities for us to expand that into different typologies, those current, relatively narrow categories that currently exist. And you'll hear more from us on that soon.
More typologies, hotels.
I'm not in a position to be able to tell you which ones now,
right.
But suffice to say,
fishing for an announcement.
It's ongoing. Fair enough. It's good questioning, but yeah. Good try.
440,000 New Zealand buildings are at flood risk. That's $218 billion worth at replacement value. This is something that Aucklanders are very, very keenly aware of after the floods. Where is the work for this? It's EB's second priority to you in their briefing as an incoming minister. We've seen a lot on affordability, but this is a real priority for most Aucklanders, and you are an Auckland MP. You'll know how keenly this is felt.
Yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that. And the questioner herself is an Auckland MP, so will be well aware of the devastation of Auckland anniversary flooding, Cyclone Gabrielle, and in my area of northwest Auckland, as the MP for Kaipara Mahurangi, acutely aware of it in August 2021, where a major flooding event had similar effect. It was less talked about at the time because it was a COVID-dominated period news-wise, but I'm really mindful of the ongoing effects. In terms of the building code, it already requires resistance to natural pressures such as flooding, but also others. But to the extent that the location of communities and asking buildings to withstand such external pressures and forces beyond that which would be reasonable, those are questions really of, I suppose, climate change, resource management and local government interactions. I'm afraid I probably can't take that conversation much further for now.
Just a further question on this. The way that central and local government have approached this is thinking about getting the right building in the right place. Yep. Central government has more control over the right building part of it and about the standards to which we build to. Yep. But in terms of the right place, we've also seen I think in the last couple of weeks, Auckland Council putting out for consultation the number of houses that from the Auckland floods they had to acquire and now can sell. It's about 30%. So for government looking at that, we're now in a situation where there is a public expectation that central government will help councils to acquire flood damaged property, and a very, very small number of them will be able to be remediated or to any kind of value. Where does that put us long term? Why aren't we urgently addressing the need for government to either take on insurance liability or to introduce some sort of levy system, because we know that central government will be asked to pay out?
Yeah, I think to the extent that it's within the committee's jurisdiction, then
to the extent that I can, given remit, etc. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, we have two levy systems already within the building space, one of which is a general building levy and the other is a building research levy. If the member's proposing that a third levy be added, then I wish all the luck in the world proposing that. But I think, the underlying point is a fair one, which is that if we build in place, and excuse me paraphrasing, but as I understand it, if we build in places that are not suitable, including, large areas of my own electorate historically, then we'll place an unfair burden on the building code and the practices within that to be able to withstand it. If I can finish on a more hopeful note, if we are about to finish, Mr. Chair. I would say that some emerging technology is potentially quite helpful in that regard. So if we're more enabling in terms of the building code around, for example, 3D printing of homes, which isn't really accounted for in the way that, framing and timber type, traditional methods of building might be able to withstand. So obviously taking as read the point that we need to build in the right place, but also in the right way. I think the possibilities are exciting for the future in that regard.
And on that positive note, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time and all fulsome answers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, team. Thanks, Thurs.
I think we're keeping most of the officials here though.
For their work. Brilliant. Cheers.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Minister.
excuse me, I have to go to another.
Go for another session. Understand.
Carolyn.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll leave you at David's
Are
capable.
you being?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. Yep. Okay. Right. You're taking centre stage, are you?
I was wondering if you wanted to pause between sessions.
Do you want a couple of minutes? Please?
Yeah.
Just to stretch.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Take. Right. Is there anything you wanted to tell us in advance that already said, or do we go straight for questions?
I don't have any prepared speech,
Okay.
and I'm not a politician, so I will just sort of sit here and
Right. Very good.
respond to questions.
Okay. Right. Question for officials now. Kim.
Thank you, Chair. So questions, I've got some questions about the building warrant fitness scheme with IQP. The way that's working, what is there any work underway at NB, building system performance or otherwise, to work on the scheme, improving it, making it more streamlined? How are we going with that? More cost effective for commercial property owners?
So we did change some of the rules around IQPs and the compliance schedule that was following the Lotus Lodge fire. So that sort of tried to emphasise the importance of those schemes and particularly councils actually sort of taking note of how often those things are happening and sort of being more rigorous in terms of their inspections and audits of those things. It's an area where we've done quite a bit of work with councils in terms of some voluntary things they can do in terms of a schedule of IQPs. Just to try to allow people to not have to register in multiple different councils. So we are conscious that the building warrant of fitness scheme probably does require some additional work.
Okay. So you got no, you want to tell?
Saying I think the penalties.
New penalties for IQPs was increased.
So
in the legislative
we've
change.
sorry, I should have finished. But so we've you've got voluntary registration schemes for councils for trusted IQPs.
Yeah.
You've got an increase in penalties. Have you got any increase in training or certification or backing for people who are independently qualified persons, or is it it's all sick now? Sounds like a lot more stick.
I think those reactions came out of the Lotus Lodge where there was a concern that some of those building warrant of fitness things were not being adequately and particularly audited by the territorial authorities. So I think what you've seen change in the last couple of years has been a response to a particular circumstance. I mean, it's an area that coming out of that, we're aware that I think we need to do some more work in. It's not an issue that would be top of the list of things that we'd be addressing right now. Obviously, the government has its own sort of work program and priorities.
There is
that we're
nothing in
focusing on.
appropriations for this, so.
Nothing, yeah.
Thank you,
correct,
that's the
yeah.
question. Cool.
Yeah, because that wasn't a matter which was brought up in some detail around, was it the small building, it was the building products?
Building products.
Yeah, it was the building products and there were concerns from the IQP industry about the capacity of the industry, the quality of the
I
industry.
think, Chair, but I think the IQP representative of the time, the ABC, they were just using any forum to get their concerns heard that
Yes.
they could.
Yeah.
It's relevant to the overseas building products. It was something.
Yes, I think that's fair, but you know, I think we're quite impressed by the quality of the submission and the thinking around that. So that's why I think
Right.
Cameron is raising the issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good point.
Yeah. Okay. Arena.
Hello, great to have you in here and always good to be able to get your advice on stuff. Let's start with the thing that the Minister was talking about around the monitoring that Carolyn spoke about ND doing quite a lot of around the effectiveness of the building products changes. It's something I raised with officials last year as well. And the help I need to understand here is the advice in 2022 was that this sort of opening up building products like this would not have a material impact on the market. However, I think that, you know, the call's been made now and everyone's incentivized to see it working. So why aren't we getting sort of performance requirements like how fast building is going now compared to previously and where the costs are being reduced? And because that's something that everybody's quite keen to see and actually keen to test about whether this is working. So help me understand what you're actually going to be reporting on.
So are you talking about building products specifically?
Yeah.
So that, I mean, there are various sort of genesis of that work program, but part of it did come out of the Commerce Commission
Yeah.
that identified that that was a problem in the system.
Yeah, and then you told us it wasn't, guys. So if it is going to be something that the government does now, let's monitor it and see
Yeah.
whether it will work.
And I think, I mean, you know, the regime isn't in place yet, so, you know, there is no monitoring right now. But I mean, certainly I agree with you completely that there does need to be a monitoring program, both in terms of the effectiveness of the scheme and how often it's being used and is it achieving its sort of objectives, but also in terms of, I think, and perhaps Ingrid can speak to this a bit later, around the products coming in and the processes we have to ensure that the products coming in are safe and being used in the manner that they're intended to be used. So, I mean, I think I agree with you, but you know, at this point in time, we don't have a scheme in place.
Okay.
We do have some plans for how we will monitor things once it is in place. So one is around being able to track the number of product certificates that are issued by MB or the number of certification schemes that are approved, or the number of standards that are deemed equivalent. So that's a quite administrative measure. Other administrative measures would be around the complaints, if any, that are received about products and feedback from BCAs in terms of types of products that they are seeing come through in terms of consent. So that's all administrative stuff. There's also some informal ways we can get information, such as through organisations such as EBOS that regularly survey architects and engineers. So we'll be looking at that, as David says, because the scheme hasn't been implemented yet. Some of this is still to be designed. I think your point around monitoring overall outcomes in terms of speed of building and cost of building is a slightly trickier question because there are so many factors that go into this. But in terms of the scheme itself, we've got a few things we can do.
Okay.
And I'll just add that in terms of the upcoming overseas products regime, Antonia's mentioned the kind of monitoring, but we do some product monitoring and assurance now. We receive complaints about performance of products. We receive those from the public or from BCAs. So we've got 15 active building product investigations right now.
Okay.
And we've completed 13 over the course of the year to date. We also have the new-ish building product information requirements, and we've done over 1,000 reviews of those since it came into place in December 23. So that we're already playing in this space. We have powers to like issue warnings or bans for products. So as a regulator, we have we've already exercised those powers in the past. So we've got some muscle and experience in that respect.
I guess that's really the question though, is that's I see that as a role of regulator, great. I'm asking about the role of system steward.
I understand.
And that, so I'm getting back that I'll ask you next year. And we can talk about how this is being monitored. Because I think that monitoring piece is really interesting to everyone. And it's also the choices around what's in. I don't know that should be around the things like cost and timeliness, which is the things that the public think we're getting out of this, I think would be a fair sort of read of the situation. Okay, can I ask you about it was to sort of Cameron's points around the consents speeding and basically the work that is being done to drive speed of consenting and ease of consent, the ability of BCAs to do that. Can you give us an understanding of how the policy advice part of your work is going with that and working with BCAs? I guess we want to tease out, not sure that you do, sorry.
I do.
I want to tease out how that relationship is working when alongside that there's also proposals to quite drastically reorganise the way that BCAs work. But those two things are sort of separate. So how are we making sure that we're getting efficiency gains in the system at the same time as looking to a future which might be quite out of the box for the way that people are thinking about it now?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of work going on at the moment that relates to the efficiency of the system, particularly through the consenting process. And there are a lot of inputs into that process as well. So we talked about the 2/3 of consents that are requiring RFIs, and a lot of that actually comes from designers. So it's not the system is quite interlinked. So the interventions we're making into the system and some that we've been talking about, but haven't actually quite got to the point of announcements around things like liability, things like looking at the BCA structural issues. I mean, those are things that I think will have quite a significant impact on that whole environment or ecosystem of consenting. Liability, for example, that the potential implications of changing liability settings in terms of the addressing the risk aversion of some PCAs, but also enabling things like potential for self-certification, perhaps enabling the more private PCAs to come into the system. All those things can have the potential to have a significant impact on that efficiency and how the system works.
I guess that's just while you're thinking about it, that's sort of what I'm asking you is there's that big long-term change, and that's something I think there is a lot of agreement with. It's the shorter term. I mean, where is it making a difference, say the uptake in the newer technologies, when we know that the big councils are already using those, it's been long in place. Like, are these kind of efficiency gains that we're talking about in the system for the speed of consenting now thing, not a midterm thing, actually, like, are you seeing them play out? How are you making sure that that's being implemented more widely? What is MB's role in making sure the uptake of that is really getting as much out of it?
Yeah, as the Minister said, and so I should say we have great engagement with BCAs. They're our co-regulator. So we have very frequent conversations and often talk to Local Government New Zealand and Taituara in terms of their various regulatory groups. So the relationship is very good. And Ingrid's team in particular in terms of managing the IANZ accreditation process. So very strong links. I mean, there are some councils that are doing some great work. I mean, if I look at a place like Christchurch, who are looking at trying to make their consent processing more sort of automated and looking at areas around that. I think there are some really good councils looking at doing some good things. And I think it's something that as a regulator, we can help them with. As I say, I think in terms of efficiencies, I think there are some system settings that we need to look at again, like liability, that just sort of take away the issue of risk aversion. It's this idea that Member Luxon was talking about in terms of having multiple professionals looking at an application just to make sure it's 100% okay, instead of relying on the one engineer who has signed it off. And that's because of the concern that the ratepayer will end up under joint several liability settings having a disproportionate cost imposed on them if something goes wrong.
Okay.
Keep going.
Yeah, go on, one more, yeah.
Okay. Just on the improving climate change resilience and reducing building related emissions work, the keen to get an understanding of where MB sees its role in the system at the moment around flood risk, and how we are preparing for, it's a $51 million policy advice appropriation, which is a pretty good one. So is the New Zealand public getting from that what is one of, I think it's Auckland's second top issue, and in terms of its people responding to what they're concerned about in housing? Are we getting for that a good sort of public preparedness in that advice?
So look, what I can say in that space is that we have just recently published guidance on, I think, building in flood-prone areas. Fundamentally, the issue is one of resource management and resource planning and town planning, and sort of not allowing buildings to be built in places where they really shouldn't be built, or inappropriate buildings in inappropriate places, I guess. I mean, fundamentally, if you're going to solve that problem, that is more of an RM issue than a building control issue.
That's right.
So could I start straight?
Yeah, hang on, we just let's let the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was probably just going to go on to say, but there are other things we are doing in this space as well. And you referred to the neighbours NZ, and there are various actions in the emissions reduction plan that we also have responsibility for. But in terms of flood prone in particular, again,
I think what you're saying is it's not actually within your purview anyway.
No, I mean, we just try to make sure buildings stay upright. Where they actually get built is up to council.
I did wonder about the new, slightly flippantly, the new building codes and whether this related to Noah's Ark. But Cam.
So going to that, I mean, that is what I was referring to in the question. So that's the minute about section 71, 2 and 3, I think it is. Or one of them, 72. Anyway, 72.
Oh, well done.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's all right. So that is a duplication in a way of what you've just said of the building. Is there any advice going to the minister that you've got about a way we could simplify that by saying this is something for the town planning and the resource consent, not for the Building Act? If you've got a piece of residential land that's been deemed safe to build on, now you have to go through another process of even if you just want an extension or a duplicate of the exact same plan on the same site. And that's what my question before was alluding to, that some of these, I've come across these issues, and it's infuriating that someone who's got a consent, who's got a development underway, is then getting held up at the consenting stage.
So we did, I mean, we have noted that there is that provision in the Building Act, which has actually caused quite a lot of confusion in terms of how you interpret that. And so we did produce some guidance for BCAs in 2023, I believe, on that to try and clarify what those provisions actually meant, because people were interpreting them in different ways. So that was an initial step to try and get some clarity there. Beyond that, I might see if Matt, do you want to just add a couple of points here?
Thank you for the question.
So you can do the identification, but 2 would be lovely.
My name's Matthew McDermott. I'm one of the policy managers reporting to David Hall. We have done some work on that space. About a year ago, we did look at the interface between the natural hazards provisions in the Building Act that you rightly referred to, section 71 through to 74. There is perceptions of overlap around similar provisions in the Resource Management Act, which is about controlling the land use and location of buildings in different spaces. Where we've got to, generally speaking, is that our view as advisors is that the provisions in both pieces of legislation generally fit to purpose. The reason for that is the natural hazards provisions in the Building Act, specifically around 71 to 74, they are about taking into account the natural hazard risk when a building consent has been processed and how the building work can mitigate and not exacerbate the risk of the natural hazard on that piece of land. So there's quite a strong interface there with the RM system and the building system.
How often, sorry.
So that's probably as far as I would
How
go.
often does MB have to get involved in, and this was a question I was going to ask soon about determinations, how many determinations you do, but in specifically, how often do you have to get involved in determinations to sort out disputes between developers and BCAs on this section?
On this particular issue, we probably don't have that figure right in front of us, but we
Do
can
you do,
certainly
we
get.
do it often? Yeah. I mean, okay, so then broadly, this is not quite a sub, but how often are you getting involved in determinations? That using a lot of time and resource?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We have a team, a determinations team. In the past or year to date, we've received 77 applications, so that's a 7% increase. Some of those applications were able to resolve as an early resolution because the parties just needed some facilitation. Many of them, though, go to a full determination decision. So we've issued 56 determinations so far in this period. And I'd just like to recognise the work of the team because we have had delays in the past with determinations, but we've been able to issue 44% more determinations so far year to date. And we've reduced the median age of the case age by over 50%. So we've done a real big play in the determinations space to get much more efficient because we know they're helpful for the sector in terms of the decisions reached and also for BCAs and consent applicants to resolve the kind of disagreement that they have between each other.
No way. Calculus in my head is not good enough to figure out whether the increase is because you've shortened the weight or the age, or because we're having more determinations. But I mean, as the building sector is in a slower period, the cycle right now, and still have an increase, what do you put that down to?
We haven't done the analysis, but my kind of intuition says that people are quicker to go to a formal process to resolve a dispute. We'll see that in some of our other dispute resolution services within MB. I think also the fees are pretty low, so it's an easy way to have someone else make a decision. To your point around, it's hard to tell whether being quicker is driving demand versus there being more disputes in the sector that need a determination. That's not an analysis we've done as yet.
So you haven't done the analysis. It'd be nice to hear that analysis when it comes back of what you think is driving that, because if determinations being relied on more, is that because BCAs or developers or design LVPs are being more obtuse and difficult, or is that be very interesting to hear some more of that?
Yeah, we can come back to the committee with the split of who's applying for the determinations. Is it the or the homeowner versus the BCA? We have that information. We can also provide information on which ones we find in favour of. So you'll get a good sense of whether we're agreeing with BCAs or decisions. So that might be helpful for the committee.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up just quickly on that one too? So is this the sort of situation where a land is zoned for residential purposes, but there is, a record of flooding, and that you might say, well, look, that there should be a certain floor level that's required to get you, so you can build, but you've got to build in a certain way to get you above the flood, the likely flood level. and that is not already specified in a district plan, that level's not specified? Or what situations are causing this?
So the provisions that were being referred to before Section 71
Yes.
of the Building Act
Yes.
requires consideration of the natural hazard in the area where the building site, and then requires that you make sure that that hazard is adequately mitigated
Yes.
as part of the building. So it's not about the resource consent for building on that site.
No, I get that.
mitigating.
So, but is it the circumstance where you're saying, yes, you can build a house on that, in that location or on that piece of land, but you've got to build it. So that's the RM stuff.
And then the
building
decision is-
consent says you've got to do it in a certain way to make sure that you're not too low lying or whatever
Correct.
it might be. That's what we're talking about, yeah.
Just to add to that point, and going back to the point that the member was raising earlier, we see the natural hazard provisions in the Building Act, those provisions in the RM system as being complementary. They go together as a package,
Yes.
but they're dealing with different things. So
Yeah, okay, no, that's cool. Right, other questions?
Yeah.
Team? Okay, I don't know, you've had quite a few. There's no. Julianne, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I kind of wanted to come back to what I covered a little bit with the minister.
Yeah.
And just really understand, like, is there any work program or team working on what was previously the Building for Climate Change program?
So the answer is yes, it's part of Matt's team. And as I said, we do have some requirements under the emissions reduction plan in terms of extending neighbours. I think I've got the list in front of me, making it easier for people to retrofit buildings. So that's one of the outputs of the ERP2, and improving emissions data. So there are specific things that we are working on. Yeah.
So it's just,
And then, sorry, there's also the solar and the sustainable buildings. Making a faster pathway for those.
is that just solar, or does that include other features in terms of sustainable buildings?
The intention is to expand it in the future, so provision has been made. So the focus at the moment is on the solar, and particularly adding solar panels, making it easy for solar panels to be exempt from requiring a consent on the roof, but also making a faster consenting pathway for solar and sustainable buildings.
What else is included in the definition of sustainable building?
I think the Minister will be making some announcement on that in the near future.
Oh, okay.
The Minister's made a very recent announcement about the fast track process for new buildings that would have rooftop solar. Announcement of that was just made recently. He's also made an announcement to exempt existing buildings that have rooftop solar from the consenting process. So that would be a new exemption that will go into Schedule 1 of the Building Act. An announcement was made on that recently. My understanding is that there may be some more announcements on sustainable buildings in the near future.
Okay. So, in terms of like building performance, energy efficiency, there was outlined a kind of phased work program to update the building code and change how, the metrics, I guess, of,
So that was a focus of the previous administration. You're absolutely right. The focus under the ERP2 is now shifting more towards an advisory approach and information sharing approach, and letting markets decide what they can do in order to achieve the government's objectives. So 3 main focus areas in ERP2 are around information sharing and information disclosure, as David was saying. It has a particular focus on determining the levels of carbon embodied into products and allowing designers to make decisions on what kinds of products will go into what kinds of buildings. So there's a focus there on driving down the emissions, embodied emissions in products as part of the design process, but the focus is on pushing information out to the sector so that they can make those decisions for themselves as part of the design process. There's as advisors, there's some early work that we're doing working with ICA to explore expansion to neighbours, the building efficiency rating scheme. It's an Australian scheme. You will know that it's quite widely adopted in Australia. I think there's 12 different building typologies in Australia that's used. In New Zealand, the focus is just on offices, commercial buildings, but we are working with ICA. It's in the early stages of expanding that to shopping malls and to hotels. I think the Minister might have touched on that earlier. And then there's another piece of work that we will be doing, which committed to in the ERP2, which is looking at relaxing the efficiency and installation requirements for existing buildings, exploring whether we can include that as a new exception to the Building Act. It's one of the 3 key actions in the ERP2.
I don't know.
Just on the actions around ERP2 and the National Action Plan, I think one of them is around making small changes to the Building Act on a no regrets basis around some of the improvements that could be made for building for resilience, something like that. Can you talk us through the advice that you've given on granny flats and how we should be thinking about, or if we do have stock of granny flats in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, where they haven't necessarily had the same sort of planning at a local council level as if they were a different sort of dwelling, how that might impact on things like flood risk and also tying into local amenities?
So this committee, I think, will be looking more closely at the granny flats and the bill from next week, I think. Part of that bill, of course, which is already in the public arena, is there are provisions in there looking at the interface between the conditions for a granny flat. So up to 70 square metres, and it needs to be a simple build, needs to be standalone on an existing plot. There will still be connections with the natural hazards provisions in the Building Act. So it may trigger, if there is a natural hazard on a particular site, it may trigger those natural hazards provisions in the Building Act. Depends very much on the site-specific characteristics. But the fundamental principle of the new exemption for granny flats is that they will be exempt subject to meeting a number of conditions.
And so how should BCAs engage with the sort of new environment where they're meant to be doing more at a desktop level, engaging more high level, but at the same time, if there is a Section 71 sort of implication identified in a property, but with a granny flat proceeding, and if they are going to be bigger, how should BCAs be responding to the government signals around that? Well, to MB signals, really.
In terms of the management of natural hazards for granny flats on a particular site. So one of the conditions in the new granny flats proposals is that the building owner will go to the council and request a PIN in a limb, so that PIN provisions will prevail, and limb provisions will still prevail. The council can then go back to the building owner and say, hey, there is a natural hazard on the site. Depending on how significant that natural hazard is, it may trigger the building consent provisions under Section 71 through to 75. So there is a de minimis role there for the local authority, while fundamentally maintaining the essence of the exemption provisions.
Have you given advice on how then those, the identification that BCAs do about where natural hazards are, say they have a flood overlay, is then impacting values of properties if you can continue to, if you can put a granny flat in Greyland, but you can't put one in Manarewa, how that's impacting on the market as a whole for housing and granny flats? Have you advice on that?
We don't have good information on that. I'm not aware of good information.
I mean, I think that probably strays more into general housing policy in terms of land and housing values rather than the construction
Probably
side
Land
of things.
Information New Zealand's role. I don't know, Stuart.
That's an area that we could come back to a committee on, but probably need to liaise with MFE in terms of getting a good sense of.
Maybe really you sort of tie that back into the work that is to be done on the bill.
Yeah.
That's something you can do in writing as part of because there will be obviously quite a few bits of information we've asked for already. You alluded to lots of stats, which we'd like to have. So if you can add that to the list, that'd be helpful. We can note that too, please, Jonathan. Okay, look, I just have one area of questions, which is around self-certification, which we kind of explored a little bit. I just wondered about the progress in this and the process that we're going to go through to say, yep, these people have met whatever the standard is for self-certification, these people have not. And that gives, well, this is all about confidence and the capability of professionals to be able to do what they're doing.
Yeah. So I'll hand over to Susanna Tolman, who's the manager who's leading this particular piece of work. Susanna.
Kia ora, nice to see you again. So for self-certification, there are two pathways that we're looking at that have been agreed to by Cabinet for self-certification, which will come in a bill to be introduced later this year. So currently speaking around November, December introduction. The first pathway is for plumbers and drain layers. And that is a scheme that will be administered by the Plumbers, Gasfitters and Drain Layers Board, and will take into account the competency and performance of the professionals that would seek to be self-certifying. And there will be changes to requirements in terms of being required to have a record of work and certify that work. That's something that they're not currently required to do by default. So for plumbers and drain layers, there will still be a consent process. It will be they will be self-certifying the work after the point of consent. So effectively saying that it's been built in compliance with the building code and consistent with the consented plans. So the Plumbers, Gasfitters and Drain Layers Board will be taking into account the particular competencies of the individual plumbers and drain layers, and they will be registering those and then collecting information about the work that is self-certified as part of that regime.
So does that mean it's possible for someone to lose their self-certification status? Yep.
Yes, and it's an opt-in scheme, but not everyone may meet the requirements to be able to self-certify.
Yep, sure.
For entire build self-certification, the process would be that MB, as indicated in the Cabinet paper, would be responsible for undertaking an assessment about whether a company is able to be registered to self-certify. And the intention is that that will take into account whether they are a fit and proper person as a company. So that will look at things like the performance of the company in terms of both its business performance, the performance of the directors, for example, and its and how it's performed as a business, as well as the adequate means of that organisation to cover any liabilities that might arise from the work. So that may be a combination of insurance or warranty cover, or bond or deposit schemes. We're still working through the details on what may be taken into account as part of an adequate means assessment.
So you see this as being, particularly the latter of those, as giving customers or would-be customers the confidence that one entity is a licensed operator, as opposed to another one which is not.
Yes. So what would so the registration process would be an assessment that that organisation is fit to self-certify, and there would be a register held of that information. So the entire build process would be therefore managed by that self-certifying company. The BCA will still be required to look at to issue what's called a nominal consent. So that would be them checking whether or not the company is registered to self-certify, and that the building that is being self-certified meets the definition of a simple residential building. That's the extent of the oversight.
Yep.
That information collection also helps the homeowner and insurers and bankers in making sure that they have the information needed and on record about the design of the building, etc., so that there's access to that information. Just going to add in a further point there, but I seem to have lost it.
That's okay. So just to be clear, that deals with the issue that Joe raised when the minister was here about concerns from some of the if you like the bulk building creators who are absolutely wrapped with this small building, the granny flat stuff, and others who are going, well, we're good for us, but we're concerned about the cowboys. Cowboys will not achieve the self-certification, and that distinction gives the market the ability to go, yep, no. Yep, agree.
And in addition to that, the homeowner will have the option of whether they wish to use a company that is self-certifying or use a standard consent process. So they still have that choice.
Yes, but they would have confidence in either.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Any other questions?
Just earthquake. Can I ask you about those residential owners, small owners in apartments and flats? The they seem to be engaging in this process in really good faith. And really, I wanted to ask you about what is your thinking around making sure that the public information is, dispersing in a way which is like widely known and widely understood by the people who are affected. And do you have any thinking around like public meetings, how to share this information in a way where people also feel like they're listened to and able to feed in?
Sure. Great question. There is a terms of reference for the review, so I might go back a step first if I may. And that sets out the framework, how we are expected to advise the government in terms of the rolling out of the review, undertaking basically a methodology for a review. There's a clear expectation in the terms of reference that we will engage with key stakeholders. So in terms of where we're at the moment, the Minister has asked us to undertake a review of the EPP provisions in the Building Act, as you know. We have worked really quite closely on an informal basis with a whole raft of stakeholders in the system. So we have spoken to in the City of Wellington, for example, you'll be familiar with them. We know that they have a long-standing interest in the EPB system because, of course, many of them are multi-unit, multi-storey apartment owners. So we understand their circumstances quite well and have for some time. If I go back a step, we worked quite closely with them in terms of development of a financial assistance scheme some years back. You'll be familiar with that. So we're fully aware of the circumstances that they face at Wellington. But I'd add also that it's not germane to Wellington. Of course, there will be people in Auckland and Christchurch and Dunedin to a lesser extent that would also be affected by the current system. So we're mindful of impacts on the residential sector particularly.
My question there is really that it's quite difficult to engage a group of apartment owners who are affected individually and as a group, and those group interests and those individual interests diverge a little bit. And so I can't think of a better way than getting them all together to engage with a group like that. It's different for the commercial sector, and I also engage with the same stakeholders that you do in the commercial sector. They are feeling really engaged and listened to. It's a bit different for those, particularly the Wellington apartment owners, many of them in their retirement years, who are looking at their life savings in a building like that.
Yeah, look, all I can say on that is that we've engaged as best as we can with as many stakeholders as we can at the time available within the scope of the terms of reference. I understand that there are some views with the portfolio about future engagement and what that might look like, but I can't speak to that myself.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? No. In that case, we'll finish in 5 or 6 minutes early and to say thank you very much for all your time this morning, and we'll